today. I would like to acknowledge that we meet on Wajak Noongar Boodja. I'm delighted we're here on the banks of the Derbo Yerrigan. If you hadn't noticed, the name of the auditorium is the Belair Auditorium. And when we asked our members that we were moving and what they would like to see and how would we name the auditorium, there was a resounding vote to link to Aboriginal culture and heritage. And the Belair system, if you know, is a water system that flows throughout. And so therefore, yes, we're based in Perth, but we represent all of Western Australia. And on your way out, there is a beautiful art piece just outside the auditorium, and it has a little story explaining the raindrops in the Belair. So I hope you can take a moment to appreciate that. I will move on to our evacuation. So we're in the auditorium, and behind us is a corridor, and in that corridor is the gents' toilets and fire stairs. On the corridor that you walked up from reception, past the boardroom and up to the member lounge, is the ladies' toilets, a unisex toilet, and also the fire stairs. So if we do need to evacuate, the good thing about doing events during the day is there's plenty of staff around. So we will go down the stairs, following staff instructions when instructed to. We go down 10 flights, and then we head out onto the Esplanade and turn left towards the Stirling Gardens to the assembly area. What I would like to say to you today is there is recording in place. So we have speakers in the room. It is an in-person event, so this is not being live streamed, but we do have speakers joining us later in the programme who will be dialing in and, fingers crossed, sharing their slides with us. And so for the benefit of capturing this, we're going to be recording, so please just take note of that. Later on, there'll be questions. If you could say your name and where you're from when you ask the question, that will help us. And Susie is at the back with a microphone. In this room, we have ceiling speakers, so if we're just presenting in person, we wouldn't need the mics, but for the recording, we're going to use the mics just to make sure the recording picks up as well. So now on to the topic at hand. You're going to be hearing from a number of experts today, but just to set the scene, I just thought I'd talk a little bit about the embodied emissions in infrastructure. So while operational carbon and operational energy are much more visible due to ongoing energy costs, the embodied carbon and embodied energy represent the hidden impacts of buildings. And these are impacts that are largely locked in even before the building is occupied. Now, the embodied emissions are generated during a building's entire life cycle, and that's from raw materials extraction through to the transportation of building products, and from powering construction machinery right through to demolition and disposal. So if we're going to measure and manage emissions across such a broad scope, it is an enormous challenge, but it is one we must tackle if Australia is to achieve its net zero emissions target by 2050. So I'm not sure if you know these stats, but the world's buildings are responsible for about 37% of global emissions. Operational emissions account for 30%, and the remaining 7% are estimated to be the embodied emissions. But as Australia's electricity grid decarbonises and more buildings are powered by 100% renewable electricity, then the proportion of emissions generated up front will rise. So we're expecting that emissions from materials used in construction, such as steel and cement, will become the largest source of carbon emissions in the building sector in coming decades. Targeted action on reducing emissions from building materials is therefore crucial for Australia to meet its net zero commitments, federally and in jurisdiction. So I've just put some references. If we're sharing the slides afterwards, I've just put some references up there. The Clean Energy Finance Corporation, in collaboration with the Green Building Council of Australia and the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, picked up some governance barriers that exist in Australia that will require consideration. So again, I'm not going to read these out, but certainly there's a few things on there that if we're going to get this right, we will need to focus on. And then my last slide is I'll just get my notes turned over. It's a refresh of the Every Building Counts, and I'm sure most of you have seen this, but if not, I've put the policy themes and the link in the slides. This was conducted by the Property Council of Australia and the Green Building Council of Australia, and they've put in a whole segment dedicated to the recommendations relating to embodied carbon. And again, I thought I would just put them up there for context, but adopt a credible national framework for measuring embodied carbon, introduce embodied carbon targets into the National Construction Code, create an embodied carbon national database for products and materials, introduce embodied carbon reductions requirements for government projects, and then support Australian product manufacturers and overseas importers to calculate and disclose embodied carbon content. And I think we should have a prize at the end for which speaker gets to say embodied carbon content the most times. Okay, so I'm already ahead. So that is just a bit of an overview and context. As I said, the experts are here to share with you their case studies and examples. That's it from Engineers Australia. I would like to thank you all for coming and to MECLA for hosting this with us. And it's my great delight to now ask Monica to the stage. So Monica, thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. Let me put that down. Oops. So my job today, I'm going to present a little bit about MECLA and also help to introduce the speakers and to facilitate the conversation at the end. We have a lot of speakers to get through, a lot of PowerPoint presentations, a lot of knowledge to share and some case studies as well. So I'd like to also acknowledge that we are on Indigenous country and to pay our respects to elders past and present. And I'm going to be here for 10 days in Western Australia. I really look forward to getting some time on country over the weekend as well. All right, here we go. So my journey, I work at WWF, Worldwide Fund for Nature, in the Climate and Energy Program, and I'm also a project director for MECLA. And how I came to be a project director for MECLA, I helped to launch a chapter for the Science Based Targets Initiative here in Australia. Some of you will be familiar with that. And for the first time, getting companies to be thinking about a carbon budget aligned with the climate science of 1.5 degrees, and also about scope 3 emissions, which we know for many companies is very, very complex to try and address both upstream and downstream supply chain emissions and value chain emissions. And then to help organisations with their renewable energy and their scope 2 emissions, help to establish the Business Renewables Centre, getting companies and organisations, councils, governments to be thinking about long-term, large-scale power purchase agreements for renewable electricity. So change the market in many ways through these catalytic projects. And in 2021, April 2021, along with many organisations, some of you represented here, we launched MECLA, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance, which is really, it's a collaborative, systems-led innovation across all parts of the supply chain to drive that kind of change. Here's a photograph, 2 councillors from the City of Melbourne. I guess the first project in Australia where you can publicly see if you're walking past the Queen Victoria building that they've very proud about how much embodied carbon they've reduced from their program. I met with the councillors probably 2.5, 3 years ago, and they said, this is what we want to do. We want to be able to get people who are walking along the path to say, oh, that's how much embodied carbon they've reduced. And lo and behold, they delivered that. Just wanted to share that with you, what's possible. So when we're talking about embodied carbon, we are talking about pretty much the A1 to A5, but also the end of life projects as well. It does include, circular economy, of course, as we think about how do we achieve a circular restorative economy in the lead up to 2030 and beyond. So this was the original piece of, I guess, intellectual property and thought leadership. How do you actually intervene in a very complex construction supply chain? And you can see right at the top, we articulated the construction project life cycle to identify what are the barriers to the uptake. You can see there, the project concept, pre-design. You know how important that design and pre-design conversations are. Ross will talk a little bit about that after me. How important the tendering process is, specifying tendering, making it really consistent and easy for material suppliers and head contractors to respond. We know that that's been a barrier to the uptake. The value engineering, that final design, and then that reuse there. So all parts of that construction project life cycle, there are serious barriers and there are opportunities for reducing embodied carbon. So when we launched, this was our purpose. Align with the Paris Agreement targets, principles of the circular economy, and we're going to do this in these ways. So that demand side, how you measure, measuring embodied carbon. It's a complex science, as some of you in the room will know. Knowledge sharing, very important. That's why we're here, to really be able to share the knowledge of the case studies and the complexities of how you go about doing it. That common language, Some of you will be very familiar with how do you specify tendering documents around that common language. The climate transition, particularly around innovative materials, low carbon materials. Engineers, by their very nature, are risk averse. How do we help to overcome some of that risk aversion? I mean, we still want the bridges to stand the test of time and the roads to stand the test of time and the buildings, but how do we do this in a way and accelerate the move towards more innovative materials? And then how do we support concrete, aluminium, engineered timber, services and systems, steel, to accelerate decarbonisation? So that's our purpose. We call ourselves a do tank. So very much about rolling up our sleeves, people participating in the working group to do things, very practical ways to achieve change. And we've got a governance system in place, and we have a project leadership group and a project control group, and you can find out more information about that later, and all of our resources are on our website as well. So these are our working groups. We have 9 working groups at the moment that are based on our purpose. So you've got that demand side signal. We know how important consistent language, demand side, head contractors, government agencies, sending the signal around wanting materials that reduce embodied carbon is really important for the material suppliers in the room. You know how important that is. We've got a working group that looks at how you measure and disclose, benchmarks, tools, calculators, very, very complex area, and that's a really important area to be able to bring some harmonisation. There's a lot of work going on in that. You know that the neighbours are also looking at embodied carbon for buildings, and Infrastructure Sustainability Council, you'll hear from them around what they're doing on tools and the calculators. That knowledge and language sharing. There's a working group looking to develop some kind of standardised tendering documents and specifications documents to make it easier for head contractors and government agencies to use that language so that then you can respond to that quite simply. And then our materials working groups, as well as our residential working group, is just kicking off. That's how we mostly operate. We don't really have in-person events very often, so this is you're very lucky to have one, and so are we, to have you all here together. And so that we do it online. And we also had at the beginning of this year, we had the great privilege to go to BlueScope in the Illawarra region to have a visit of the BlueScope facility there and see how complex, hard to decarbonise. Steel is a really hard to decarbonise sector. You'll appreciate that being in Western Australia. Complexity of how do you create iron ore, taking a raw material like that and turning it into green iron. There's a lot of conversation about that, but how you do that is really complex. So I'm just going to share with you a few examples of what we've been able to do in MECLA. So this working group one of their ideas was a pledge prerequisite. So this is a pledge for that government agencies give to head contractors to say, as a head contractor, I pledge to have as a minimum an embodied carbon target, and as a result, that provides that consistent signal down through the marketplace. So, you can have a pledge, it can be a science-based target, but some kind of pledge that is disclosed in the public through annual reports that a head contractor has, that then allows the head contractor to go out to the marketplace and secure the lower embodied carbon material. So we've shopped that around to many, many government agencies. I heard, last week that the South Australian government is going to adopt that in their transport and infrastructure program. It's yet to see the final regulations, but that's what the South Australian government's going to do. So this is going to be the first government to adopt that wholeheartedly, that idea of a pledge. So that, I think that it's created, sort of catalysed some changes in thinking. I know that's certainly helped the New South Wales government to start thinking about how they could help to drive this, and you'll hear more about that from our New South Wales colleagues. Another example from our concrete working group. They have been, you can see here both the demand side and the supply side of members from this working group, and how, the complexity of concrete, each of those materials is so different. How do you get specifiers to be specifying for the low carbon concrete material? How do you get the people who use and apply the low carbon material to know that it has a longer curing time? How do you set that into the time frame for the rollout of the projects that you're working on? We know that Standards Australia has traditionally been looking not at performance-based applications. So I know that there's been an accelerated conversation with Standards Australia and Smartcrete CRC to try and drive changes through the performance-based specifications system. And as a result, we know that companies like Lendlease, Lang O'Rourke, some of the contractors here are working really seriously with your supply chains to actually identify and drive the education and capability for the industry to move forward. The Victorian government, they have now specified 40% or more for supplementary cementitious materials, and we had a myth-busting event last month where there was a showcase 70% supplementary cementitious materials for one particular project. So, if you want some more information on that, I can share that with you later. And one of our other working groups looking at aluminium. So aluminium is used in many different ways in many different constructions. We produce a lot of it here domestically, but we haven't had access to low carbon aluminium products. You can see, we have in the working group, we have Rio Tinto. We also have our aluminium extruders. We've got Sims Metal. And we've been doing a very deep dive with each of the head contractors and project managers to say, are you asking for low carbon aluminium? And originally they were saying no, and now they're starting to ask for it. And you can see that the market has shifted. And lo and behold, in this whole time, we now have Locale, Capral, is producing a low carbon aluminium product. And it's the first for Australia. So just being able to intervene in that marketplace, having those conversations. Locale has been launched, and it does not come at a green premium. So that's a really interesting shift in the marketplace, just in a very short period of time that we've seen. So there's a couple of case studies. We also know government is a key enabler to make a change occur, both through policies, but also as a procurer. Billions of dollars of money is spent by government agencies every year on infrastructure projects, building and construction, and it's the policies and the procurement agencies that are helping to drive that. We're going to have a few speakers from the New South Wales government to talk about how they've used the MECLA network, setting their ambitious net zero carbon targets, and that very close engagement between industry and government, which industry is often really asking for in the early stages of the project being developed, has made a real change. And we'll also hear from some Western Australian government agencies on some of the magnificent work that's been happening here as well. So very briefly, we've had an injection of funds from the New South Wales government as well as the South Australian government. For that, we're very grateful. We've also had some modest funds from our private sector partners and organisations, and we are organising, so myself, WWF, Kati Vaheran over there from Climate Kick, and our chair, Hudson Worsley, as well. And it's great to see just the cross-collaboration across industry to make a difference in this area. That's who we are, and that's it. I'm going to open now to, we'll move to the next speaker, but I just wanted to give you a kind of a taste of what the opportunity is for creating a kind of network where you bring the different players across the ecosystem together to make that kind of change. So now I'd like to introduce Ross Donaldson. Ross is an architect from Western Australia, and is one of our real champions from part of the project leadership group and project control group, and I really value, Ross, in your engagement in MECLA and your thought leadership. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Monica. With that. No. we're doing it by the handheld, not by the... This is for later. Yeah. Thanks a lot, and thanks, Monica. I'm going to talk primarily about pre-design strategies. And interestingly, this slide here is from a spotlight that MECLA runs regularly, and that was the topic of one of the spotlights which I facilitated. But just as a heads up, there's fantastic resources on the MECLA website about all this stuff. So you're just going through the spotlights that are pre-recorded. There's great stuff around carbon and aluminium and steel and myth busting and pre-design strategies. So the MECLA website is a really good intro to very useful and market-leading knowledge sharing, because it's market leaders who've contributed. So there's that one. Okay, so I'm talking about upfront or embodied carbon. Those phrases get tossed around a bit. Upfront design and pre-design, and upfront integrators. So there's a bit of an upfront theme to this. And the underlying theme, which as Monica knows I'm always banging on about, is we have to start measuring. So if anybody is not measuring, find a way to start measuring. I tend to think and try and work within a frame of trying to imagine a zero carbon construction industry, including offsets, by 2035, so carbon neutral. And why 2035? Well, this IPCC 6 report, that graph, which you can kind of see, hopefully, there's an inflection point around 2035 when these decisions about which way we go make a massive difference to the end of the century outcome. So that's why 2035, I think, should be in everybody's mind. I'd move away from 2050, maybe the whole country by then, but for the construction industry, 2035. Now, you can't manage what you don't measure. I heard that phrase out in the outdoors out there when we were gathering together. So I'm sure in this environment, most people would accept that. So measuring is critical. And what are we measuring? Well, we're measuring whole of life carbon. And Monica showed a version of this. This is a slide from one of those spotlights where Lucy from Atelier 10 did a presentation about defining the boundaries and where our thinking needs to be. So it's the same EN 15978, which is the European standard for how to measure carbon in the construction industry. Personally, I find it a much easier way of thinking about it than scopes 1, 2, and 3. So within the construction industry, because it clearly lays out where the carbon is. So the first on the left is product, the second is the construction phase, all the product elements and the embodied carbon within them. And then there's the use phase, which is actually a very important part of it for lots of reasons. And the example I would use for why we need to focus on the use phase is one of my colleagues at Bridge 42 shared with me a case study just recently, like this morning, about a piece of work being done for a hospital where they were making the choice about whether to put gas in the hospital or not. Brand new hospital, gas, no gas. A large number of $1 million was associated with the capital cost of doing away with the gas, going 100% electric. But we've done this work, I shouldn't say we, my colleagues, have done this piece of work to show that in the 20-year life cycle, first 20 years of the life cycle of that building, that $20 million will come back many times. So we need to be pricing actual dollars for these things. And it's not just the carbon offset costs, it's all sorts of other costs, dual systems, maintenance systems for gas, price of gas, all that kind of thing. So there is now emerging very hard-lined, hard-nosed number thinking for things that are in phase 2. So Monica, I just forgot to start my how many minutes you got? 3. Okay, all right, I'll allow for 7 there. So, and the key thing about all of this is the integration of the team. And this is a message very strongly for architects. You can't start without the rest of your team around. It's also a message for clients, because a lot of clients will ask an architect to start before the team is assembled. And there are many, many reasons why that's a very bad idea. So here's a piece from the same Spotlight. This is Bridget Danks from Arup, who made the point that 40% of the world's carbon is in the construction industry. So there's numbers bound between 37 and 40%, who cares, 39% a lot. But typically, according to Bridget, 60% of the carbon, the embodied carbon in the building is in the structure and substructure. So it's a huge target. And so you've got to be thinking about that. Architects have got to be thinking about that before they even start thinking about the building. And I'm going to elaborate on that in a bit. And this is a very common graph that's often used, but it makes the point that all of the gains that have been made right at the beginning, all of these savings are from day one. Architects can't give drawings to engineers to solve the problem. It's already far too late. So it's why pre-design is really the main theme here. And this is some work from another very, very good firm of engineers, international firm based out of London, Bureau Happold. And just looking at some basic structural systems, and I'll probably go over here to sort of point to a couple of things in a minute, but taking a very simple building and comparing concrete, steel and timber, and looking at the embodied carbon in each of those. And you might be able to make up for the concrete slab for a sort of business as usual, that's 331 kilograms per square metre. For a composite and steel slab structure, it's 227. For a CLT and glulam system, it's 142. That's your starting point, the starting point for business as usual. So this is a really good ready reckoner that they produce. So you take, and I'm not going to try and explain this, I appreciate that it's very small, but they look at a whole bunch of different strategies for a concrete structure of how you'd get the embodied carbon in there, putting aside all other factors. One of the things that I really focus on, if you go from a 9 metre grid to a 6 metre grid, you'll go from 331 for 200 just in that one step. Maybe we have to accept that we don't have column-free buildings in the way that we currently come to expect it. If you're looking at low embodied carbon concrete, it goes down to 175. There are separate strategies. You can go through many of these and come up with a much larger number. That's just individual strategies. Then they do the same for, that's the point I just made about each of those things. Then they go through steel and timber. But this is the point I really wanted to get to. I'm not sure if this is controversial, but by their account, and this is British context admittedly, they go for a concrete structure applying a series of strategies from across the field of the options from 331 down to 54. So that's a sixth, I think, isn't it? A sixth of the embodied carbon in that concrete structure that is still concrete. And with the others, with steel goes from 227 with all of them down to 66, or use a steel timber hybrid 62, and the timber goes down to 41. So 41, 62 and 54, they're not particularly different numbers. So I think there's a bit of potential myth busting in there about the way concrete has been included in this conversation, but it does rely on low embodied carbon concrete, of course. And when you move into a life cycle assessment process, and this is taken from eTools, one of eTools printouts, who are just down the road. Richard Haynes started eTool here in Western Australia, and he's been helping me a lot with my journey with all this. This is a printout from their eTool platform from 3 years ago, which shows you can schedule all the different materials, all the different embodied carbon and life cycle carbon, and how you can start focusing on where the real carbon is, how you can tackle individual elements of it and start playing with the design. That requires you've got a design that's integrated through a BIM platform to optimise it, of course. And this is some more work by some other local folks, Daniel and Tristan from IFLab. Tristan is now with Oricon, where they've used a parametric grasshopper platform for dialing in different options for materials in a timber construction, the project that we're doing with Peter Hobbs and Patrick Beale. And just the animation worked. It's amazing. How did you do that? You guys are geniuses. That's never worked in a sort of other than off my computer. So you can see they're changing the parameters in the grasshopper framework. That's being reflected animated in the design, and they're moving through various options of excuse me, timber sizes and you know, open section, not solid timber. And through that process of, you know, quite a simple grasshopper platform, simple if grasshopper can be considered simple. And they show, just in terms of one of the parameters they're looking at, the shift from composite down to solid, they've sort of more than halved the amount of embodied carbon even in the timber construction. So even with timber, there are a lot of design factors that you can play around with to really get that carbon down. It's another piece of work that Bridget showed in her piece, Arup work, where they're using a similar parametric platform associated and linked in with sort of an AI thing where overnight they generate an optimization process for different orientations and form of the building. So using a similar parametric structure now, Arup and I'm sure others have got this to a point where you do rapid iterations, which is a very important part of the story. Back to the idea of building less and the point about the emphasis on non-demolition, which is a really big issue in the UK now and increasingly in Australia. This is a famous project in Circular Quay in Perth by 3XN, where they kept all the core, great multiplex project. A couple in Melbourne, where the top of this building has been added on to the base of that one. So all of the existing building was kept. Obviously, that's the cheapest kind of carbon you can get. There's another one by Finder Castellides there. And a very famous project that's been in dispute in the UK, the Marks and Spencer project, about whether or not it should be demolished. And just getting towards the conclusion, this is an example of some of the resources that are on the MECLA site and other resources that people like the Institute of Architects that I've helped sort of put together. Start measuring. City of Vincent requires LCAs for all development approvals. That's a key signal, the first in the country. And in the UK, it's a hot debate. And the House of Commons report from last year, which said, and this is the Environmental Audit Committee report of the House of Commons, the single most significant policy the government could introduce is mandatory requirement to undertake whole-of-life carbon assessments for buildings. This requirement should be set within building regulations and planning system. We all need to do our bit to encourage the regulatory environment in this country to get to that same point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. Yes, we know how important architects are to this process. We also know that measurement is fundamental to the success. And Ross, you're lecturing to architects at the various universities here in Western Australia. I know we're having conversations with Engineers Australia around how to create some micro-credentials for engineers in the area of embodied carbon. So up next, I'm going to turn to our guest speakers online. I have the delight to be working closely with Dana Jacobs and David Kelly, who are members of the New South Wales government, and I thought it would be really valuable for people, particularly those in government and those who contract to government, to hear what the New South Wales government has managed to deliver to in their projects here. And I will hand over to Dana. So Dana Jacobs is an Executive Director from Infrastructure New South Wales, and David Kelly is an Acting Director Engineering from the Sustainable Infrastructure Program at Transport for New South Wales. So I'll hand it over to you, Dana, to kick off. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. As Monica said, I'm Dana Jacobs. I'm an Executive Director at Infrastructure New South Wales. I have responsibility for our work on sustainability and resilience, and I'm joined by my colleague David Kelly from Transport. We're here to speak to you about some of the initiatives we're implementing in New South Wales to integrate embodied emissions into our decision making. I'm going to focus on whole of government policies, while David's going to speak to you on more project specific initiatives. If we could go to the next slide, please, David. So for Infrastructure New South Wales, this work has come out of our 2022 State Infrastructure Strategy. The strategy included a recommendation for us to work towards net zero in public infrastructure. This is a very broad area, as you would understand. There's already a lot of really great work going on by agencies who are very focused on their operations. So we identified a gap in action on those upfront emissions, on embodied emissions. And to get the ball rolling, we released a discussion paper with a set of actions in October last year. And we followed this up with an event to start a conversation with industry about this. In the next slide, you'll see we followed that event up with a series of targeted roundtables with the full construction supply chain. So that's everyone from the materials sector all the way through to industry peak bodies. And the consistency of the feedback was amazing. It blew us away. No matter who you spoke to, they said, we need better and more consistent ways of measuring embodied emissions. We need a clear mandate from government and incentives to act. We need to consider carbon very early in the process of thinking about projects. So you need to be putting it into the business case process and make sure you're thinking about embodied emissions as you develop options to respond to policy problems. And finally, from the civil sector, we heard that prescriptive specifications can be a problem. And you'll see in a moment that we shaped our work program around this feedback. Our program directly addresses the issues of measurement and policy incentives and early consideration of carbon, and the point around prescriptive specifications we're picking up through collaborative work with other agencies. So what's on the screen now is our work program, and we have 3 key work streams. The first is to deliver a policy on how to manage embodied emissions in New South Wales government infrastructure. The aim of this work is to set that clear mandate that industry was asking us for. And that document is to provide agencies with guidance on how they're to consider embodied emissions as they develop their projects. It's going to reflect the discussion paper we released back in October. So it's going to emphasize the need to consider carbon very early in project design and options analysis. And it's going to tell agencies what it is that they need to be putting into their business cases to demonstrate that they really have thought about embodied emissions right from the start. We're expecting to engage with industry on this policy in the next month or so, and that'll be through a very early draft, but we expect the policy as a whole to be completed by the end of the year for release early next year. The second work stream you can see on the screen is the protection of environment policy. This one's a regulatory measure. We're developing it jointly with the New South Wales EPA. It's going to require measurement and reporting of embodied emissions as part of the development approval stage, and it's going to be considered by planning authorities as part of the approval process. So it's going to give a bit of teeth to the work we're doing. It's also going to require project proponents to maximise the use of recycled materials. The third work stream you can see on the screen is around measurement. So this was pain point number 1 by so many people. And we just heard that if you can't measure it, you can't do anything about it. So we're trying to measure it. We're working to deliver that consistent way of measuring for all infrastructure, both buildings and civil infrastructure. We want to make sure we're equipping project proponents to measure their emissions at all relevant points in their project. So that's at the business case stage when they're thinking through their options, at development approval when they're putting in that approval to meet the regulatory measures we're working on, and at completion. So we start to actually gather a good set of data on what emissions are associated with all our project types. Our approach here has been to align the main tools used in New South Wales government. We know it's already a noisy field. We don't want to add to the noise. We want to start consolidating. In New South Wales, the main ways of measuring emissions in this space are the NEIGHBOURS tool that's being developed for the building sector, and Transport for New South Wales' existing calculator, the carbon emissions reporting tool. So what we're doing is we're bringing these 2 approaches together and aligning the back-end parameters. The measurement approach should be ready for use by the end of the year, and we expect to release it late this year or early next year in time for use under the policy and that protection of environment policy, that regulatory measure I mentioned. As always, we're planning on doing this collaboratively with industry, so we're going to be out consulting with industry in the next couple of months as we start developing early parameters and so on. So on the next slide, please, we're All our work has been done very collaboratively with all our colleagues from across New South Wales Government, particularly Transport for New South Wales. Transport are leaders in this space, and we've benefited a lot from their experience as we've progressed our work. We've really built on things that they'd already started testing out. And our respective work programs are very aligned and coordinated. And to demonstrate this alignment and ongoing collaboration, we've published a joint roadmap on our milestones out all the way to 2026. So with this, I'm going to hand over to David to talk through the transport program.
Thanks, Dana. Thanks for having us firstly. I'm David Kelly, I'm Acting Director Engineering, and I lead our Sustainable Infrastructure program. So we have embedded resources across our development branch, commercial performance and strategy, Sydney project delivery, rail delivery, regional project delivery, and portfolio optimisation and innovation. It's quite an ambitious program. We're due to launch it over the next few months. So just touching on the roadmap that Dana mentioned, I'll just sort of take a step back and just go through how we formed those milestones on the roadmap. So on the screen, just to set some context, we obviously have our New South Wales Net Zero plan, our future transport strategy, the state infrastructure strategy, which Dana produced, and in particular recommendation 27 there. We've been doing some fantastic work in the operational space. Sydney Trains is the first to transition to net zero, Metro offsetting 100% of its operational electricity, and our zero emission bus program. But around 2 years ago, we went through a major restructure with our roads business and rail business merging together. And there's a lot of fantastic best practice, but really wasn't lifted up across our portfolio. So we set out with industry to start to shape up how we can get that consistency and implement it across our portfolio. So as I mentioned, for around 2 years ago, we started Sustainable Procurement and Infrastructure, an initiative that realised we had huge procurement power. So this is subject to change with the incoming infrastructure review, but I think we've got around $76 billion worth of projects to deliver over the next 4 years. We're one of the largest procurers of projects in Australia, and we realise that we've got a lot of potential to bring about change. So we started an accelerated pilot program. So there's around just over $5 billion worth of accelerated pilots. The M1 to Raymond Terrace behind me is an accelerated pilot. And just to give you a feel on what we've been up to these pilots, the M1 to Raymond Terrace had a 10% emission reduction target that was bid back to 25% and included on the deed. I think the indicative savings are around 45,000 tonnes CO2e just through that procurement transaction. So a lot of fantastic work happening on our mega projects like M1 to Raymond Terrace, but all the way down to our smallest road widening. I think the smallest pilot project's around $6 million. So we think we're getting a framework together that's quite scalable. So in unison with this, we were obviously looking to do this with our industry partners, and we've got one of the largest industry engagement campaigns for a corporate document at Transport. And last year we delivered a discussion paper. We offered a formal response to industry. We held 5 targeted workshops and then released our industry engagement workshop report. Been working very closely with MECLA. So the first 2 workshops, Hudson Morsley, the chair of MECLA, hosted those 2 workshops. I think for the cohort in the room, workshop 3 is particularly important, designed for decarbonisation. So I think there's really poor correlation between low carbon materials and low carbon assets. And this workshop sought to unpack how we can start to design for decarbonisation. Workshop 4 is around standards and specifications, and I'll chat about our move to performance-based specifications shortly. So as I mentioned, the industry engagement workshop report, so we had over 370 attendees from 135 organisations. That was captured in our industry engagement workshop report, which I'll get MECLA to circulate following that. But most importantly, those priority actions that we developed with industry were integrated into the roadmap with Infrastructure New South Wales. So really one clear, consistent approach out to 2026 with Infrastructure New South Wales and Transport and broader New South Wales government. Slides just... So these are the key themes that were raised, and I'll just run through some of the milestones on the roadmap. So Firstly, our sustainable procurement framework, as I mentioned, we've got a lot of accelerated pilots, and it's time now to start to integrate that across our portfolio. So the procurement framework is designed for core and complex delivery models. It has requirements for strategic stage, for concept stage, and importantly sets minimum emission reduction targets across our portfolio, including embodied emissions. We're developing decarbonising infrastructure guidance, which will be released shortly. And the challenge, we talked about measurement. I think in New South Wales, we're getting a lot closer to consistent measurement with the work that NSW are doing. And I just wanted to touch on some of the challenges we have. So we've seen leaders such as High Speed 2 in the UK and also National Highways UK move to a certified carbon management system. And I think we're definitely getting to the point, as Dana mentioned, in New South Wales, where we can start shifting the conversation to carbon management, not just quantification. And so in the roadmap, Transport for New South Wales has a public commitment to move our portfolio to a certified carbon management system, similar to National Highways UK. And it's an important document past 2080 because it sets out obligations for asset owners, managers, designers, our contractors, and then also the supply chain. So what does our path look like? And this is set out, it's quite high level in the roadmap. I'll just give you a bit more of a feel on what we're up to. It's a need to get the fundamentals right, particularly moving to whole life carbon. I think Ross mentioned that. It's a great point. And to do that, Transport, we're linking costs, whole life carbon and engineering design built up to past 2080. And so really what we're looking to do is for carbon to be a core component along with cost, schedule, risk and other project functions. And we're doing this with an international partner in the UK Infrastructure Agency. And so contractors will produce quantified decarbonisation plans analogous to cost plans using assured lower carbon alternatives from a central library. So really looking to move to coupled carbon cost management. Standards and specifications is an Engineers Australia event, so I couldn't help but pop this milestone on the roadmap. So our civil standards and specifications will be assigned a whole life base carbon rate at an item level, so a specification level and then also a resource level underneath that. And we'll be then forming up carbon intensity thresholds. So it's a performance-based approach to our net zero trajectory. And I think incentivisation was mentioned earlier. So on the roadmap, we made a public commitment to incentivise lower carbon outcomes after we deliver that robust and assured whole life carbon management system. So really key is to continue to work with organisations like MECLA. And I think in New South Wales, we've got a very consistent and integrated approach towards decarbonising infrastructure. So thanks.
Dana and David, that's really great to hear your journey through this process and for the government as well. So before we let them go, I thought it would be good for us, if you've got some questions, to don't forget to ask for them. Put your hand up, and Susan, I think, has a microphone there. You'll be able to run around. So I guess one of your core values, obviously, is sharing some of the knowledge in your journey with other jurisdictions. Perhaps you can, describe a little bit about some of the other jurisdictions you've spoken to and some of those, key opportunities you see if we start to get more of that, more jurisdictions across Australia to be engaging in same but different ways you have been. Thanks.
I'm happy to do this one, David. So as part of our journey, we engaged with the other infrastructure bodies. I'm going to say I bodies from here on, meaning Infrastructure Australia, Victoria, so on. And we brought them along for all the roundtables that we held with industry. Following that, we set up a working group with all the other I bodies to share the knowledge that we're developing along the way. And as they've become more interested in being active participants in this area, it's been great because there's so much to be done. We've been able to start dividing up the task between the different jurisdictions. So Victoria have expressed a lot of interest, for example, in procurement and are researching that. And increasingly, we're able to split the task among the jurisdictions, which is, yeah, a really good direction and very unusual in the policy space to see this.
Yeah, and I'll probably add to that, Dina, is I think from our perspective, it was actually in Perth last week, we had a national options paper endorsed for the Infrastructure and Transport Ministers meeting, which Dina played a key role in developing that as well. So I think there's a consensus across all of the transport infrastructure agencies that we should be tackling this in a consistent manner. And I think it's going to be a very exciting 6 months to 12 months while that plays out.
Yeah, the great news with that one is actually, I should probably mention this, that the consistent approach to measurement, there's a lot of interest in actually taking the work from New South Wales and applying it nationally. So once we finish our work here, we're going to look at how we expand it to cover the rest of the country. And the aim is to have that ready by the middle of next year.
Fantastic. That sounds like a really great amount of progress that has been made, and I'm sure that the private sector people who operate right across Australia would be very heartened to hear that. Now we've got a question here.
Hello, my name's Barrett Moulds. I'm from the Sustainable Engineering Society of Engineers Australia. My question is for Dina. How did you go about getting funding, probably from Treasury, for including decarbonisation into infrastructure projects? And could you give us an indication of what sort of, was there an uplift in the capital programs allowed for it, and sort of what sort of percentage increase that may have been? Thank you.
Thanks. I guess the short answer is we haven't had an increase from Treasury in capital funding allowance. The idea is we're trying to actually reduce cost and carbon together. So we're trying to stop people from building projects when a different solution could be available to them. So what we're pushing for in working with Treasury is we've updated the cost benefit analysis guidelines to include carbon, particularly embodied emissions. And so the costs associated with carbon emissions is now being taken into account when a project is approved. So the benefits really do need to outweigh the carbon as well as the other costs. And hopefully that is starting to make people think twice about building bigger things when a smaller thing would do. Through the policy we're releasing, we're trying to push for consideration of non-build options more seriously. So is there a technology solution? Is there a policy solution rather than building a new thing? Okay, if you must build a new thing, is there an existing asset that you can be adapting rather than building something from scratch? The beauty of this is that all of those things are actually associated with lower costs, that people don't need to be allocating further funding for it.
Thank you.
So in fact, the report that you shared, Susan, from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation has a couple of case studies in the report on the ability for the pre-design part of the construction supply chain, where you can reduce the cost by up to 25% by just designing out, and you don't have to gold plate everything. In other words, you know, I think that's one resource there. And definitely Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, they put out their report on decarbonising infrastructure that has sort of similar case studies in there that you can design out that gold plating to be able to make those carbon savings as well as financial savings as well. Is there another question?
Thanks very much. It's probably a question for David. So Janine Barr from Jacobs, Global Tech Lead for Sustainability and Climate Response. I often talk about the 4 Ps when it comes to embodied carbon and some of the real barriers around it. So process, prescription, procurement, we've heard a lot on those. The 4th one is people and the barriers that creates. So I just wondered what you're doing in sort of Transport for New South Wales around, you know, getting your people on board. And then there's also, just aligned with one of those points, the procurement side of things. It's fantastic that you're looking at PAS 2080 and the latest updates. Have you looked at how PAS 2080 applies in an Australian context? Is there anything that you're going to have to do to, you know, probably not wholesale, just you know, prescribe the use of PAS 2080 in all of your contracts? What's the sort of subtleties for for your jurisdiction?
Oh, they're both fantastic questions. I will say that Denna and I are both grappling with the people and capability uplift side of things. I think it is the biggest challenge. We did address that. We actually had one whole workshop with industry on trying to unpack the capability education piece, and I think we've got a long way to go. I think from Transport for New South Wales perspective, the fact that the role that I'm acting in at the moment, there's 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there wouldn't have been this type of engineering-based role to embed decarbonisation principles into standards and specifications. So I think that there's a step change occurring at Transport for New South Wales, and particularly around the minimum emission reduction targets across our entire portfolio. That's being pushed by our executive at Transport. So I feel like we're just on the cusp, but there is a large journey in terms of capability building. On PAS 28, it's a fantastic question. So we're working very closely with National Highways UK, obviously a leader in this space. They've just certified their entire portfolio. I think we've got around 380 projects in infrastructure in place. Where I work, there's over 500 active projects, and embedding PAS 2080 across that portfolio is going to be quite complex. But I think that it will probably look like fairly short supplements underneath that. So we've just started putting our first set of requirements for concept design, embedding PAS 2080 in concept design. And that's part of a broader piece of work that we're actually developing that will be forward-facing our sustainable procurement and infrastructure standard, which will have a lot of those components that sit underneath PAS 2080. So I guess watch this space, and we're really looking forward to sharing knowledge with the other jurisdictions as we start to move to that certified carbon management system. And I think if you're working at Jacobs, I think it'll give you consistency. You're probably getting a lot of different briefs come across your desk that some great, some not so great project briefs. So I think that moving to PAS 2080, understanding those designer-specific requirements will be great for consultancies. They'll be able to streamline their systems to work around PAS 2080.
Great questions, folks. I think that we probably will draw that to a close now so we can get on with the rest of our presenters. So Denna and David, thank you so much. You guys have really been fantastic leaders here, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of your Monday to come and join us and share your knowledge, experience with sort of industry, government agencies here in Western Australia, and look forward to continuing to watch the journey that you are on and the New South Wales government is on in really being able to forge the path forward in that area. So thanks, and we'll let you go now.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so that was really exciting. I always really like to hear how we're going now. So Tyrell Momberg from the Infrastructure Sustainability Council is now going to be talking about the IS Council's sort of upgraded rating scheme. So please, over to you, Tyrell.
Hi everyone, my name is Ty Momberg. I'm the Technical Manager with the ISC, and I'm here today to talk about the IS rating scheme and how it assesses embodied carbon. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today. We acknowledge their deep connection to land, water and culture, and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So I really want to start off with a little bit about the ISC and the IS rating scheme itself. And the ISC has a number of products and offerings. So we have events, we have trainings, we have advocacy, but really the core of what we do is the IS rating scheme itself. And how does that IS rating scheme work? It is a whole of life consideration that's split across 4 rating tools. So there is the planning, IS planning rating tool, there is the design rating tool, the ops rating tool, and then finally, it's the as-built, and then finally the ops rating tool. So that's how it's split across those 4 of them. And each of those has a 4-step process. Step 1 of the process is that the infrastructure project registers with us, registers with the ISC. The project then undertakes an assessment, and it starts to gather the evidence for the relevant credits that it's targeting. They send that through to us, and then we send that back out to third-party verifiers where QAs and checks are done. The final step of the process is certification, obviously once all the credit criteria have been met. And you can see it's probably a little tiny, but at the bottom of the slide, you can see the different award levels. So it starts with bronze, silver, gold, platinum, and finally diamond. The IS rating scheme is across the quadruple bottom line, and it looks at governance, environment, social, and economic impacts. And each of these themes is then further broken into different categories, and you can see all the categories within the slide. And then it's broken down yet again into credits, and projects are able to target the credits. So just as an example to illustrate this, if you look at the energy and carbon category, so that's under environment, that's further broken down into 3 energy credits. Energy 1, that looks at the infrastructure projects, how they deal with their efficiencies and how they deal with their overall emissions. Energy 2, that looks at renewables and the quantity of renewables on the infrastructure project. And then finally, energy 3, which is offsetting, which can obviously only occur once they've gone through that process of looking at efficiencies and renewables. That was just an example just to illustrate the hierarchy. So it's the themes, categories, and then down to credits. Those initial slides were just to give you a high-level overview of how the tool looks and what it covers, what is included. This slide is really to illustrate how it's gaining traction across Australia and New Zealand. So currently, we've got about 245 active ratings, and that changes kind of on a weekly basis as more projects register. And that's worth nearly $200 billion of capital value. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see how it's broken down firstly by infrastructure type. So 114 road projects, 85 rail, 9 port, 7 airports, et cetera, In the middle, it shows how it's split across the rating tools. So 17 planning, 111 design, 61 as-built, and 12 in the ops. And then finally on the far right, how it's broken down by geographical location. So 34 projects in Western Australia, 2 in South Australia, 42 in Queensland, et cetera. You get the gist. So now on to embodied carbon in the IS rating scheme itself. Embodied carbon is really broken and looked at across a multitude of credits, and these are all displayed on the slide at the moment. And all really starts with sustainable procurement. So that is this, and this credit rewards a sustainable procurement strategy that requires materials that have a low embodied carbon, that requires materials that are locally sourced, and requires materials that have EPDs, et cetera. Next, we have the options assessment. So that really rewards projects for having a whole of life consideration, which includes the social cost of carbon in all of their major project decisions. We have a number of materials credits, but the main one is really the looks at the life cycle impacts of materials, and we use the IS materials calculator to demonstrate reductions in embodied carbon. And I've got some more details in the calculator in the next slide. We also have a number of innovation credits, which look at embodied carbon, and one on circular economy. And then lastly, we have the offsetting credit, and that's the one I spoke to briefly before. So this is offsets, obviously, only of the remaining of residual emissions, and that includes embodied carbon associated with materials. IS materials calculator. So this is the calculator that the IS projects use to look at the life cycle impacts of the materials on their projects and to demonstrate reductions in embodied carbon. It works by comparing the base case, which effectively is a business as usual design, to the actual case. And then it starts calculating things like, firstly, the reductions in quantities of materials itself. And then secondly, it looks at calculating and rewarding good material selection. So actively choosing materials that have lower embodied carbon. You can see in the lower screenshot that this calculator looks at all the major materials associated with infrastructure projects. So just from this list, asphalt, concrete, aggregates, et cetera. And then lastly, this calculator looks at reductions between the base and the actual, both in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also something that we call IS EnviroPoints. And that's effectively the indicators associated with an EPD with some normalizations and weightings applied. This is my last slide, and it just highlights how the ISC is monitoring the impacts. So we do a number of things in the space. Firstly, we track it per project, and that's obviously included in the IS rating per project. We then also aggregate the reductions and emissions per financial year, and we record that in our annual impact report. And there's some screenshots at the moment from our financial year 2022 impact report. And then within here, we track by a number of areas on the screen at the moment, showing that we track by circular economy outcomes and by resource efficiencies. So some examples of the circular economy outcomes include an aggregated 7% usage of RAP, an aggregated 8% reduction in asphalt compared to base case, and an aggregated 96% diversion of waste from landfill. The resource efficiency metric on screen is an aggregated 16% reduction in life cycle material emissions, which really is the overall embodied impact of all the projects certified in financial year 2022. This report also does more. It also looks at projects who've performed well in a particular category. So it's probably too small to read, but some of the projects that performed particularly well include an inland rail project, which used over 2.5 million tons of recycled aggregate, the Regency to PIM project with a 66-ton reduction in asphalt compared to business as usual, and the Ipswich motorway upgrade, which had a 61,000-ton reduction in concrete compared to business as usual. There's a multitude of other kind of efficiencies and reductions in the report and longer case studies, so please do go on our website to download for free. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyrell. And are there any diamond projects here in Western Australia? Not yet. Aha, there's an opportunity for WA to step up. So next we have Linda van Achterberg, Sustainability Manager, Public Transport Authority, Office of Major Transport Infrastructure Delivery. So we're talking a little bit about infrastructure at the moment because we know how important it is and the billions of dollars that are going into the spend there. So Linda, I think you're up next. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. My name is Linda, and I'm a sustainability manager with the PTA and OMTID, and I'll explain that a bit later because I don't think many people understand the relationship. A little bit about me. I'm a civil engineer by background, and I've been working in construction and project delivery for 14 years, so at the coal face, pun intended. And so I'll be talking to you through how we're actually implementing sustainability and decarbonisation on some of our rail infrastructure projects. So I'll firstly provide you a bit of context and overview, and then just some interesting outcomes that we've achieved on our projects. So for a little bit of context, most of you should be aware that there's a little program called Metronet underway. So basically, it's a program of a lot of rail projects, and it will add about 72 kilometers of new rail and 23 new stations. And this is the single largest investment in public transport in Perth's history. So how this works, Metronet is obviously rail, they're a program, but somebody has to actually deliver it, and that is the PTA. So the PTA is the signatory to all the big contracts. And how it works is the smaller projects, less than 100 million, is basically done by PTA in-house at the East Perth office. And then you get the big projects, and that is actually delivered by the Office of Major Transport Infrastructure Delivery, called OMTID. And in that office, it's basically a combination of public transport authority people and main roads people, and was established in 2022 so that we can all kind of work together, share knowledge. So that's why I actually work very closely with the my counterparts at Main Road Sustainability. And then, of course, there's still Main Roads who does the other smaller projects, maintenance, all of that kind of thing. So this is an overview of all the Metronet projects. You can see there's quite a lot, and a number of them have already finished. So the airport line opened last year, Lakeland Station opened earlier this month. And for all of them, they all follow the Metronet sustainability strategy. Now, this was a great strategy, like from a couple of years back, and it basically has a lot of targets, a lot of initiatives, all playing into the economy, environment, and social aspect. But today, I'm going to be talking to you about only the 6 major projects. So these are the ones that are delivered by OMTID, where I sit. So these are the Yanchep Rail Extension, the Morley-Ellenbrook Line, the new Bayswater Station, the Armidale Level Crossing Removal Project, the Byford Rail Extension, and the Thornley-Coburn Link. So I'll be highlighting some outcomes of our strategy, which is formal sustainability ratings, carbon reduction, as well as circular economy initiatives. So 3 of our projects actually are contractually required to obtain IS ratings of silver. And they're all on the way there. Morley-Ellenbrook is a lot more advanced, and they actually submitted their round 2 design last week. So we'll have a good indication of where they're heading. In addition to that, a number of the stations are also required to be Green Star certified, a mix of between 4 and 5 star. And very interesting to note that the Morley-Ellenbrook line has got 2 stations, Ellenbrook and Malaga, and the Bayswater stations, obviously Bayswater. And they all require to achieve 4 star contractually, but they've actually had their recent design review, and they've actually on track to have 5 star, and some of them might be going to 6 star, but don't say that too loudly. So how the projects kind of reduce their carbon impact. So we require all the projects to do life cycle assessments at different stage gates. What this means is the concept design is kind of when the project is awarded. They do a concept design LCA, and that quantifies the base case, which is also what IS then uses to measure their carbon reduction. Because obviously then the engineers get involved, they refine the design, and then we'll make them do an initial design LCA. So that indicates the carbon impact of the likely design. So this is beautiful in that it allows them to then target their efforts in the detailed design development. So they then optimize it based on which are the major impacts. And then they do a final design LCA, so that is the final carbon impact of the final design. But of course, it doesn't stop there, because they have to procure, and that depends on which suppliers, which materials they pick. So there's still a lot that goes into that. So at the end, every project does an as-constructed life cycle assessment. So that gives us a very good indication of, through the life of the project, how we can actually influence what we can do to reduce the carbon impact. So this is an average of all our projects. I think this will agree with some of the previous figures given. So as you can see, materials make up a vast proportion of the carbon impact, especially during construction phase, which is 37%. And this is, for that little pie chart, this is the actual makeup of the materials. So this is for the Morley-Ellenbrook line. So as you can see, more than half of the embodied carbon comes from metal, and then 25% comes from concrete, and then it's made up with all the other items. And this is also another example of how one project has actually reduced their carbon emissions from the base case up to now, which is the final design. So you can see they've had a lot of savings in energy and a lot of materials reduction. So this is what we're actively doing, and this is how we're actively making an impact on our big projects. And how they do this, it's usually portlet cement replacement is a big factor. And then obviously in reduction in material quantities through design optimization. That's quite a win-win because it's called value engineering. So engineers, commercial, everybody likes it, sustainability. And then the same for construction methodology efficiency. So they often look at precast and that kind of thing to reduce the transport. And then lastly, I'll talk to you about how we've implemented circular economy. And I'll first highlight two recent initiatives, which is the PTA specification updates and then our materials reuse platform. So what we've recently done, as previous speakers have noted, is that the specifications always have been very prescriptive. So we've actually in Embodied worked to update the PTA specifications, and we've done it specifically to encourage increased use of recycled materials. So we've targeted these materials. It's quite a number, and just to give you an update, so we have updated our landscape architecture spec, which now preferences the use of FOGO. We have updated our roads, pathways, and paths spec, and this also gives increased quantity for CRC, RAP, crumb rubber, and recycled rail ballast. And we've also updated our specification to include the use of recycled plastic pipes. We're still working on the one on recycled sands and low carbon concrete. And this will, the idea is also to make it more performance-based. This is just the first run. We'll keep kind of revising the specifications to keep making them better. Another initiative that was recently launched, not by us, by Department of Transport, is called the Materials Reuse Platform. This was launched 2 weeks ago, so it's fresh off the press. So this will act as an online marketplace for excess materials. So our major projects, as well as some main roads projects, we're speaking to other agencies, will all be able to list, like, if they have excess fill, if they have excess ballast, but also if they have temporary works, sheet piles, office furniture, whatever, they can all list it on there. And the idea is that everybody can then see it and then almost have first dibs at using it. So that's to encourage reusing materials instead of sending them to landfill. So with those two things in mind, overall, what we as an agency are trying to do to help the circular economy. So we want to drive the circular economy and promote resource efficiency. So firstly, we reduce raw material demand, and that is through setting contractual targets for materials reduction, as well as forcing contractors to do LCAs. We're also promoting the use of recycled materials. So these are once again by setting contractual targets, actively engaging with contractors and suppliers, because it's quite a tricky relationship commercially. We also update our specifications. We do demonstration projects to kind of, as Monica alluded to, send a signal to the market that there is a demand. And then we've also now have the materials reuse platform. So with all of those things combined, we also support the recycling industry here. So by doing that, we're trying to set an example that government wants to use recycled materials. It helps build confidence. If the government does it, then private sector will hopefully follow. And by doing all of that, we try to create demand to grow the industry capacity, and that will hopefully also bring down the price and will allow recycled materials to be used through more projects, both public and private. And yeah, that's it.
Thanks. And what a fantastic case study there, and great to see how engaged industry has been in driving that circular economy. And I'd love to hear more about that materials platform as well. Maybe some of us on the East Coast might be interested to hear more about it also. So we've got two more speakers, so hang in there. Greg Ryan from Development Western Australia, please come up.
Afternoon, everyone. would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet, which is the Whadjuk Noongar community, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. A bit about Development WA. Development WA operates statewide with an extensive portfolio of projects. We have planning powers which extend to redevelopment areas such as Subi East. We deliver long-term complex projects to support the WA economy and the growing population of WA and to help growth and investment in the regions. We also respond to market failure. Probably the most recent example of that is getting into social housing, which is a new area of business for us. And we pride ourselves on innovation through demonstration as a response to a sustainable future. So today I'm going to bring it down a notch to talk about a local project. This is a land development project that Development WA has done in Hamilton Hill. The site is the former Hamilton Hill Senior High School, which is the hill in Hamilton Hill. Development WA acquired the site and commenced planning after the high school closed in 2018. The school buildings were decommissioned and a hazmat survey was undertaken before any demolition commenced. And stage one of the project has been completed, which is largely the western half of the site, which incorporates most of the public open space and the road network. And that's the focus of this case study. So the demolition, which commenced in 2019, was a bit unique. An application for a licence to crush the demolition material on site was made to the Department of Environment and Water Regulation. Normally, crushing licences are only approved for prescribed premises because of the potential for noise and dust issues. But as this site was relatively removed from residential and sensitive land uses, it was successfully granted. So through that process, 96% of the recovered concrete and brick material, timber and steel was recovered, and most of that concrete and brick was processed as recycled aggregate on site. And we use the IPWIA and WALGA recycled concrete aggregate specification for the supply of recycled road base. So the on-site resource recovery resulted in about 10,000 tonnes of demolition waste, which if we compare that to exporting waste off-site, would have resulted in 1,000 fewer truck movements, 9,000 litres of diesel and 663 tonnes of CO2 equivalent avoided. The use of recycled material has been in road base, but also used in stormwater infrastructure. And like this infiltration bed, which was later turfed and is used as active POS. The use of recycled brick was also used in landscape features, as well as permeable paving. And even new materials for civil works, such as the retaining wall blocks, were sourced with 100% C&D waste. The project also achieved a balanced cut to fill and lots and built form topologies designed to retain the landform. Timber salvage from the clearing of vegetation, which was minimal, I should say, because most of the trees from the former school were retained. But some of the salvaged timber has been reused in POS furniture, artworks and nature play equipment. And even the decorative concrete breeze blocks from the old school were used in the traffic sound wall that you can see on the bottom right. Recently, we've had some work done on the project by a Murdoch PhD candidate who's undertaken an LCA for the recycled aggregates used in the project. This research hasn't been published yet, but indicates considerable savings from the use of 100% recycled concrete aggregates as road base, due mainly to the minimum transport required and not having to quarry and transport new virgin materials. You can see the improvement there, but I think ultimately there was a 95% reduction compared to if we had have dumped the material to landfill and then imported quarried material back into the site. But lastly, I just wanted to touch on what we're doing as part of our drive towards net zero at Alkimos Central project. Alkimos Central is a new master planned community around the new Alkimos train station that was just referred to in the previous presentation, which is due to open up next year. The Alkimos Central project is a 6-star Green Star community and was recently certified by the Green Building Council. What we're proposing to do is follow the Climate Positive Precincts roadmap, which has been recently released by the Green Building Council, which you can see the 6 principles there. And the middle one is, the fourth one along is build with lower upfront emissions. What they're proposing as part of the new version of the Green Star Communities tool is that all projects from 2024 on, under the new version of the tool, will need to have a target for embodied carbon, starting at a 10% reduction, which will gradually ramp up over time for new projects. So as a way of future-proofing the Alkimos Central project, we've incorporated a 20% reduction target into the civil works tender, which is currently being assessed. So we'll be looking forward to working with the proponent to see how we can target that reduction in upfront and embodied carbon going forward. That brings me to the conclusion. I'd just like to acknowledge the project team for the 115 project, which was Josh Byrne and Associates for Landscape, Water and Sustainability, Merit, who were the demolition contractors, and Taybeck, the civil engineers. And also to acknowledge our resource recovery research partners, Eugen Lucky, the PhD candidate, and Professor Martin Ander from Murdoch University, and Earthcare Recycling, who is our industry partner. That's it. Thank you very much, Monica.
Thanks, Greg. Great little case study there. And Mark Taylor, you're our last speaker for today. So Mark is the Sustainability Manager at Hesperia. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Monica. Great. Thanks, everybody. Some interesting conversations. So, yeah, Hesperia is a WA-based, WA-focused property group developer. We are signatories to the World Green Building Council's commitment to net zero buildings. We did that in 2021, and we're really just starting to deliver on that commitment and some stuff that sort of came out of that for us around how we do our projects. So I wasn't sure what to do today, but I thought I'd just give a kind of pretty warts and all impression and some of the speed bumps that we've come across so far. So in terms of, where we're coming from, as I say, we're signatories to that commitment, but really fundamentally, our directors are committed to making sure that we have dealt with our carbon, essentially. So that is that we acknowledge that our work and these carbon emissions exist, happen, and we want to make sure that we reduce those as much as we can, that we understand what they are, we reduce them, and that we make sure they're recaptured, any that we can't avoid in the delivery of our business. And there's really 3 sort of realms, I guess, we're dealing with. The our organisation, so the way we work. So one of the first things we did was become a carbon neutral organisation, pretty straightforward. Our projects, so the way that they happen and the materials that are used and the things that happen on site. And so we've committed to this, measure, reduce and offset, 100% offset upfront carbon emissions. I don't know where that upfront term came from. Ross mentioned it before. I blame the GBCA for it, but upfront. Embodied carbon, really, in buildings. And then once we get into operation, we currently are mostly building. We have a few stabilised assets, but our portfolio is just sort of slowly moving from a construction one to an asset holding portfolio. But we make sure all the projects can run on 100% renewable energy. We now have no more gas. A few things slipped through, like commercial kitchens, where they argue for a gas connection, or at least having a gas tank there usually. And sometimes we have industrial. We have a big industrial portfolio, and sometimes some of those operators still need gas in their actual process, but not in their building. So just to zero in on that upfront piece and the way we deliver that, it's very similar to what Linda was talking about, and others have kind of alluded to. It's pretty straightforward, but we, as early as possible, sometime when the concept of the building's been established, we get everybody together. We get all the consultants, design consultants, to estimate the materials quantities that we think are going to be involved based on the concept, and look for design strategies and changes of materials to try and reduce that footprint. And we do that, use an LCA to identify which are the big items. And we have some great consultants that help us with that process. We reduce the footprint, like I say, through material selection and design decisions. And we're trying to establish a process where, because we're offsetting, we have a kind of price on carbon, if you like, or a shadow price, it's referred to, because we know we're going to be spending the money on it later. And we're trying to get that workshop process to work around consultants bringing ideas to us that will reduce carbon, and us sharing the benefit or working through a business case for that initiative based on the carbon reduction. And the offsetting helps you monetize that, essentially. When we do offsetting, when we started this in 2021, we set a sort of policy that we would have at least 50% biodiversity-based offsets, and the rest would be from, they're all verified, but mostly renewable energy projects around the world. It turns out the renewable energy ones are a little bit more certain. The biodiversity ones have had a lot more doubt cast upon them in recent times. We've been pretty lucky. We sort of settled on a project in the wheat belt here, which is a more expensive way of doing those kinds of offsets, but we could see the project, we could go and visit it, and we're pretty confident about what it's doing. So we're sort of avoided a risk there by spending a bit more and keeping it a bit more local. And the bottom line is that we currently use about $30 a tonne to do that early stage costing, and usually that means around about a 1% uplift on the total project construction budget. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but we still have a lot of arguments about that 1%. It's an expensive time to be doing buildings, and so there's discussions about everything, including sustainability. And the final thing there is reporting. So we use the same standard, 15978, and others that Ross spoke about earlier. And we're also just keeping an eye on Climate Active and other ways that we can use a framework, established framework to report on what we're doing. Neighbours is sort of coming up with something as well. Just to help us communicate what we're doing, because that is a big part of showing the value to our projects and to our investors. European investors just want to know what we're doing about carbon anyway, but in Australia it's a bit more about why would you do that and what's the benefit. So it's a pretty straightforward process and aligned to what everyone else has been talking about, but just in terms of things that come along as kind of speed bumps to this. So even if we get in there early and talk to the design team, it's still a challenge. Them coming up with the materials data is a bit new still, and so that can be a little bit fraught. And also, especially with structural engineers, their concept design is usually the final design. Like the idea gets fixed pretty early, and it can be really hard to challenge that. And every change is sort of a reference to that first thought, which is not an unusual thing in engineering. But you know, again, this is kind of new. It's new in Australia, it's particularly new in WA, and people are getting better and better, and it's kind of fun to be part of, but it does have its little speed bumps. Cost, so you know, that's great that we're doing reduction and so on, but you know, it's still it's a lot cheaper to offset. You know, a timber building is a much more expensive building, even with the cost of concrete and everything else at the moment. It's really, you need the right client to settle on a timber building. And even the easiest option really is low carbon concrete, and that's something we just put in by default. But when I, you know, run the ruler over that, it's actually quite an expensive way still of reducing carbon in buildings. If you go to the suppliers, it's not, but it's a thing I think Monica mentioned about programming, the effect that it has on the build, and especially when builders are not really used to working with it, they just factor in a lot of time that ends up being a lot of cost. Just about, you know, one of the things about this process is that you have to wait until the building's finished before you get the final numbers, so you can do the final version of the LCA and do your offsetting. And so what you're saying to the project teams is that we're going to give you this sort of estimated footprint and a forecast cost of offsetting, and multiply those two things together to get a really uncertain number, and you're going to have to sit on that in your budget until the very end of the project, and they hate that. And the last one is just around, a bit like I was saying, you know, being able to clearly articulate what we're doing and see some help people understand the value of that, and also make sure our project teams see the value in doing that. And there's, you know, we certainly have, every time we kind of publish something that we've done, we get lots of good feedback, and there's definitely a real hunger here to have people being ambitious and trying to deliver on that, but you also get people picking holes and having a go at you about how you could do more. Just fine, it's part of the process, but it's just a thing. Just really quickly, I won't go into the detail of these projects, they're not my projects. First 5 here from a report that Built put out, which is great, and it's really great when people put their data out and their numbers so that we can sort of get a more mature conversation going. But you can kind of see there that the concrete and some of the material stuff probably gets you to something like 10% at the moment, and the bigger improvements are around design changes, which is great. It's absolutely true that the size of the building and the need for the building and the way that you design the building are the bigger elements. You also have to keep in mind that those design improvements are against a reference case, and the building of reference cases can be fraught in itself. But it's still, the message is there that design is still a really important piece. The biggest number they've got there in terms of reduction, it's pretty hard to read at the top there, sorry, but the right-hand column is the reduction that they're claiming, and the biggest number is against the basically complete reuse of a building structure. I've also got Lend-Lease in, hello Phil. So Lend-Lease has got similar targets to us actually, going net zero, you know, around about now on projects, and absolute zero by 2040. I saw a published piece from Lend-Lease that in 2022 on their bids, they were achieving something like 30%, which is, you know, pretty impressive. The Buller-Catagen Centre, as many people here hopefully have got to see down at Murdoch Uni, amazing, stunning building. All timber with concrete cores and concrete foundations. They're achieving 55% reduction in the claim embodied carbon. So that's kind of where that industry is. I think it's a reasonable picture of where the industry is sort of starting to get to. And just in terms of next steps for us, more work on the structure, more low carbon concrete, moving to timber, looking at green steel if we can find it. It's not really a thing, to be honest, at the moment, but it's coming. Looking at where non-structural elements can be more quickly transitioned to other options, hempcrete, timber maybe, whatever it is, but where that might be easier and quicker to do. And just the site works, we're lucky here, we mostly have electric cranes, but whereas they're diesel more often in the eastern states, but there's a lot of machines on sites that run on diesel, and that's something that's, it's hard to directly influence for us, but we're doing our best with. And then on the offsetting side, we've got some really strong relationships with Aboriginal groups in WA, and we're just trying to work with them to get carbon farming projects a bit like the one in the wheat belt going, so that we can be closer still to our offsetting and really get those biodiversity outcomes, which are actually, to me, more in the long run anyway than the carbon piece, I think, even as we work to moving away from the need for offsetting. So that's just kind of a quick overview of where we're at. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. So you're buying your offsets from Australia's only gold standard project here in WA, which is fantastic. And of course, the next conversation in the built environment is going to be around nature positive, but that's a conversation for another time. So we might invite all of the speakers, please come back. We'll have about 10 minutes for people to ask some questions. So as you prepare your questions, just we run through our, so I spoke to you about a bit. Everybody's turning their mics on, and Linda, if you can sit here and then I can pass the microphone to you there. So we had myself, I spoke a bit about MECLA, I talked a few case studies, remember the pledge prerequisite, the concrete around performance specifications, and the low carbon aluminium design product. We had Ross talking about the importance of the design and pre-design piece and how important measurement is. We had Denna and David from New South Wales government talking about that early engagement with industry, the $78 billion that they're spending on infrastructure, and how much work they're doing in that deep engagement in trying to develop the message around specifications. Tyrell, you spoke about the importance of the IS Council and the rating scheme and the embodied carbon piece. We had Linda showcasing circular economy and resource efficiency. Greg Ryan, had the case study around the reuse of materials. And then Mark and I guess where the built environment is up to where you as a leader, Hesperia as a leader here in Western Australia, and sort of thinking through those really big opportunities for setting some goals and helping the industry to shift. So we've done a lot, infrastructure, buildings, precincts, and I'd like to open it up to any questions that you might have for anybody here on the panel. You just have to wait for a microphone, please.
I would say this is for Linda and Mark, but maybe anyone who wants to chime in. Regarding implementing circular economy strategies in infrastructure and the built environment, are there any barriers that are unique to WA or maybe just felt more in WA that you think you could talk about?
Who wants to tackle that first?
I don't think there's anything unique per se. I think, the barriers that we found so far is there's a lot of finger pointing. So everybody used to say, the PTA specifications don't allow it. So we're like, okay, we'll change the specifications. And we changed the specifications, and now there's like, no, the supplier can't supply, and what are you going to pay me extra, and I won't take the risk. So I think, and that's the same story for any new and novel thing all over the country. So I don't think we've really seen anything that's particularly unique. I think it's just spread, and some states, you'd think they'd be a bit ahead, but they're actually not. I think we're actually pretty far advanced here. And our market is a bit small, so that's the only, so we're trying to get like recycled plastic on our projects, but everything comes from over east. So even though you now have plastic, it still has to come from over east, but you need to do that in order to create capacity here and demand, so that hopefully the suppliers can eventually set up in the factories here. So I think that's the only thing that we found. Initially, you almost have to go backwards from a whole of life sustainability before you can go forwards.
Yeah, I was going to say kind of the same thing. I think we don't even make stuff out of raw material, let alone recycled material. So that whole part of the circle's got to develop, I think, to be doing it in WA. But I also think there's still a bit of a pioneering town sort of feel about Perth and WA, where it's a bit short-termist, and so that is kind of a barrier in itself. But I don't think there's anything fundamental.
G'day, Phil from Lendlease. I'm probably going to ask Mark a question. With your targets, how are you finding your clients and your investors? You know, there's obviously additional costs that go along with some of your targets, and are you finding that they are on board as much as you are in terms of delivering on those?
Yeah, is it working? Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And it sort of depends. There are projects where we're really essentially delivering on someone else's behalf, and more often than not, if they're completely in control of the project, then they're not as into it as we are. And they might be happy to do Green Star, but maybe not the offsetting or whatever it is, or they'll do the renewable energy because they think it'll save money. But so that, yeah, we often find that they're more the Australian investors, whereas European investors are asking us for more, always more, and they're asking really sophisticated questions about, like when will our project be stranded? Like when will regulation mean that this building you won't be able to use this building anymore because regulation will have surpassed it, which they have mapped out in Europe. And we have to say, well, probably never. But all the same, this is what we deliver. So when we've got someone who is a pure investor in our portfolio, we deliver our stuff, our strategy, and it's not usually any kind of a problem. But when you've got someone else who you're giving a choice to, suddenly it's a little bit harder work sometimes. Yeah.
Not sure. Am I on? Two things. One, I'm a bit more optimistic about regulation catching up and stranding assets a bit more earlier than perhaps you're suggesting. I desperately hope it's the case. And the stranded asset thing, I think, really does need to be part of the conversation. Also, I think I touched on it a little bit with my comment about the hospital. I think if we really get serious about whole of life pricing, and we think about 20 or 30 years about all the costs, particularly for people who hold projects, not hand them on or sell them, then that's a different picture. And the third thing is that Bureau Happold set of tables I put up there. I think if clients put more pressure on their designers to drive down quantities as part of meeting carbon targets, so putting the pressure on the designers with the targets, designing down the quantities, which was a lot of what that Bureau Happold thing was about, simply less concrete, less steel, more optimal structural systems rather than expansive gestures that an architect might come up with, then I think we can shift the culture of design around, and architects to pick up more responsibility for designing material out of projects, including reuse of existing buildings, which is a big deal in UK now, not yet here, but they are already legislating, they're demanding that you have to prove that it's a lower carbon output to demolish a building.
Sorry, I just want to jump in and say exactly the same for infrastructure. So our calculator really emphasizes that too. It's also about using just less and better design.
Less and better design. We have a question.
Mark, the discussion about stranded assets and then Ross's example about gas in the hospital. So couldn't gas be considered a stranded sub-asset of the hospital, and there'd be a large cost in the whole of life cycle cost assessment to retrofit some years down the track? And does that get considered at the moment?
It should be. I totally agree. I think it's, the whole thing about procurement, and to some extent people, about some of the encumbrances here in Western Australia, I think there's an attitudinal thing that needs to become matured in terms of the whole client world and a bit more overt public voices of leadership in this area. I think we're all a bit quiet about not wanting to stand up to state positions a bit still here, and maybe that's what you were talking about, I think, Mark. But the client has to procure the project to optimise the outcome, including integrating a team from day one. That's the point I was making. So they have to brief projects that way and procure them that way, and then do, sort of 20-year, 30-year life cycle assessment, including taking into account stranded assets and when demand for, offsetting comes in and the price of that, all those things together. It needs to be a much more sophisticated approach rather than just focusing on capital cost, because the picture changes dramatically when you move on from that.
Yeah, I was just going to agree that a building with gas on it is going to be stranded soon, and it's stranded now because it's more expensive to run, and it's not. In a couple of years, it's gone from something that's quite a difficult conversation to have to something that I think most people are pretty well on board with. I don't have the same experience, Phil, but it's not so much of an argument anymore because people, particularly after the kind of crisis of prices in the eastern states, I think we didn't suffer so much here, but I think people realise that you're exposing yourself to something that could be quite volatile.
That's the crazy thing about the hospital. It wasn't a dumb conversation. They just didn't get it because the short-termism, they had a budget. They, saved $16 million by putting gas in the building. They seem to. As soon as you go into the operational mode, it's nuts. But the people who are running the project aren't briefed by their seniors to think that way. Got a budget? Run it to the budget. We'll look after operational costs separately. Don't you worry about that. So the phases of, in that EN 15978, you have to link the phase A, which is the upfront stuff, to the operational embodied carbon, and that's the bit that often gets missed. The operational side has an embodied carbon component to it, and maintenance and all that sort of stuff. So that's why I don't particularly like upfront carbon, because it tends to focus on phase A, not B. Need to bring them together.
Absolutely. So we might wrap it here. One more question.
Hello. Hi. I'm not sure if this is a question, more of a comment, but following on from what Ross has just said, something we're not talking about very much here, and it was sort of almost made at the beginning, there was an assumption that as the grid moves to all renewable energy, but one of the things that's really not, I don't think, addressed very well at the moment, certainly in WA, is the performance of the buildings, and particularly the thermal and the energy performance of the envelope. And I've been on a bit of a journey over the last 6 months, learning about passive house standards, which are now becoming sort of mandated in a lot of places around the world. For example, the City of Vancouver for all their new multi-residential buildings, and the idea of airtight buildings that are highly efficient and have extremely good air quality. At the moment, our building code is frighteningly behind. I'm having conversations at the moment with people explaining things that I learned about 20 years ago in the UK when it comes to an airtight envelope and what that means. And it's, we've got a few residential passive houses built here, which I went to visit one yesterday, and they're extremely interesting. I think there's a lot of skepticism about that sort of standard, and I think once you start to actually really upskill and understand it, that skepticism and those myths get busted very quickly. So I think it's just a kind of, you have to talk about everything at the same time, and so we're talking about embodied carbon and the measurement of that, but I think there's also still a massive attention needed on massively reducing the operational costs in terms of carbon and energy use. over time. But again, it relates to that whole of life cost versus upfront capital cost. And at the moment, the culture here is very much short-term and upfront cost focused. So, yeah.
Greening the grid will not be the total solution because it's assuming there's no carbon in creating the renewable energy, which is rubbish. And so that thinking needs to go to that next level too now, I think.
Yes, I think the catch cry, everything everywhere all at once, isn't it? We can't forget all those elements. So I'd like to thank our speakers. Fantastic to hear from different parts of industry and government on the ambitious plans, some of the challenges, what we need to think about as professional people trying to drive decarbonisation, and really appreciate you all coming here today. And I'm going to pass it to Susan to make some final comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just a quick ask, because we actually squeezed this session in today, and we've got 150 people coming tomorrow morning for the UDIA and Engineers Australia hosted event on the Aboriginal Cultural Act. So my ask is, would you mind picking up anything that's under your chair and taking it through for us so that we can get a quick reset? That would be much appreciated. I'd like to thank the team again at MECLA and lining up such a great array of speakers. Engineers Australia is also on the Circular Economy WA steering group through myself. We're also part of the Built Environment Reference Group, so we're with the architects, the Planning Institute, UDIA, the Property Council and the Landscape Architects, so that's a really good place that we can bring conversations together like the one that was just raised. And yeah, lots going on, so I think a few things we should be tying together as we move towards net zero. But thanks again to MECLA for coming, and we now have coffee, dessert, tea and water in the collaboration zone if you would like to head that way for networking. Thank you.